Rotator cuff or rotary cuff, which is it? Well, it really could be both because both of them describe what the rotator cuff really does, but the medical term for it is your rotator cuff. So shoulder pain is always going to have some involvement from the rotator cuff. It's a fact of life. And the reason is that your rotator cuff has everything to do with stabilizing and moving your shoulder. Anytime you have any stiffness, any soreness, any aching, any pinching, any radiating pain, anything from the shoulder or the shoulder blade, anywhere into your arm, anywhere in that whole quadrant, that always has something to do with the rotator cuff. The rotator cuff is a group of muscles in your shoulder blade. They all attach to your shoulder blade and they extend out and attach to a part of your upper arm. All of those muscles have something to do with stabilizing and moving your shoulder. So the two major jobs of the rotator cuff, first is to stabilize the shoulder. Its job when you're writing or typing or playing on your phone is to hold your whole shoulder complex and your shoulder blade still and keep it from moving. So if you've ever watched an elderly person write and their arm is jittering and their writing looks as if it was jittering, it's coming because they don't have good stability from their rotator cuff muscles to hold their shoulder blade, to hold their upper arm, to hold everything still so that they can write. Now, rotator cuff problems or the rotator cuff muscles also are involved in every movement you do with your arm. So as I reach into a cabinet, now the rotator cuff muscles have to do both of their jobs at the same time. They have to stabilize the shoulder blade and stabilize other things, and then they actually create the movement. So they would lift the arm, they would move the arm in the socket. The biggest part of that is that the job of the rotator cuff muscles is to keep the space in between the humerus, the bone in your upper arm, and your shoulder blade, that bone that you feel on the top of your shoulder. It's to keep that space as open as possible as the arm moves. So typically you will see rotator cuff problems in shoulder pain, especially with movement, because what's happening is as the person is moving their arm, the rotator cuff is not doing both of its jobs together and with equal workload. The joint is closing, the tendon is getting pinched on, etc. When you start to have problems of ache, stiffness, etc., it usually can come on because of one of a number of different reasons. Rotator cuff problems usually get started because of repetitive things, a lot of overhead activities, just overuse in general, so picking up something that's too heavy. If you overstretch your arm, you reach too far for something. If you fall and you stretch your arm out and you land on it. Or if you fall and you land directly on your arm. But those are all things that typically lead to a shoulder problem and a rotator cuff problem. And what happens in each of those is that in that overuse or that repetitive activity or picking up something that's too heavy, the tendon and the muscles that attach to it in the rotator cuff get too tight, they get too short. So that space in the joint closes up. When that happens, then some structures get pinched on, whether it's the rotator cuff itself that gets pinched on, a bursa that gets pinched on, the bone that gets pinched on, but something gets pinched on because the rotator cuff isn't keeping the joint open. The problem then progresses a little bit further and the friction there's friction that develops and pinches even more on that structure, causes it to get tighter. You actually start to get some weakness in the shoulder. And what we'll see is that somebody that's having a problem, let's say with reaching or tucking their shirt in or putting a coat on, just starts to do those activities less or do them not at all or do it with the other hand. And what happens is even though the pain is less, the space in the shoulder joint is still the same. It hasn't increased. So the structures that were getting pinched on and giving you that soreness, that pain, that tightness, that pinching, whatever it might be, are still getting pinched on and still causing the symptoms, even though the problem is felt less. The tightness persists, it actually gets worse, and that's how rotator cuff tears actually progress. So we commonly think, somebody thinks rotator cuff problems are only tears, but the reality is every shoulder problem is a rotator cuff problem. And it comes about from just regular everyday activities. It can come about from I lifted too much weight in the gym or I fell and landed on my shoulder. But typically you'll hear it or see it in somebody after they've done a lot of cleaning a shelf or painting a wall or something along those lines. Did a lot of gardening, I was down on my hands and knees, whatever it might be. That pressure caused things to get tight or over-fatigued a group of muscles, the space in the joint didn't stay open, the pressure can cause the symptoms, and the problem gets going. One of the greatest things about physical therapy is that we can put our hands on a patient and do a number of things with that. One, figure out, is that space in the joint as much as it needs to be? And if not, what needs to be done to get it to be as open as it should be so that we can get the pressure off of the rotator cuff? Number two, we can evaluate how strong and how stretched out something is, how loose something is, get that space back to being open. But the greatest thing about physical therapy and the expert physical therapists that we have here at Loudon Sports Therapy Center is that we put our hands on the patient, we devise a treatment plan specifically to the shoulder problems that you're having, because even though every shoulder problem has a rotator cuff involvement, every shoulder problem is different. We figure out exactly what your rotator cuff is or isn't doing properly and address those symptoms. So if you're having any problems in your shoulder, stiffness, aches, sore, pinch, cracking, popping, you name it, it is a rotator cuff problem. Get yourself in here, get yourself scheduled for an evaluation. Let's get our hands on you. Let's figure out what's causing your problem and get it taken care of before it turns into a much bigger problem.